In the summer of 2014, I followed a drainage creek off the main trail in northern West Virginia and found a village that, according to every map I owned, did not exist. There were houses, 7 of them. There were gardens, late-season beans, the stalks heavy. There were clothes drying on a line, hand-sewn, the stitching visible even from the tree line. But in the 40 minutes I stood at the edge of that settlement, I did not see a single living person. And yet every curtain in every window moved, one at a time, in a rotation I could almost predict. That was 12 years ago. I've never been able to find that village again. I've never been able to explain what I saw, and I've spent every year since collecting stories from people who've encountered places just like its settlements in the folds of these mountains that appear on no map, obey no census, and operate according to rules that have nothing to do with the world the rest of us live in. 13 of those stories are what you're about to hear. Some of them are mine. Some belong to colleagues, rangers, surveyors, and local people who've lived their whole lives in the shadow of ridges that are older than most civilizations. None of these people had any reason to lie, and all of them, when they finished telling me what they'd seen, had the same look on their face, not fear exactly, but the quiet resignation of someone who has learned that the map is not the territory, that there are places the map was never meant to include. I need you to understand something before we start. I'm not a paranormal investigator. I'm not a content creator who walks into the woods with a camera looking for a story. I spent 22 years working for the United States Forest Service across 3 Appalachian states, West Virginia, Virginia, and a stint in the Holler region of western North Carolina. I carried a field log and I carried a GPS unit. I noted coordinates, took soil samples, filed reports. I was trained to observe and document, and that's exactly what I did. What I'm about to share with you is what I observed, what I documented, and what I cannot, after more than a decade of trying, explain. Turn down the lights if you want. This works better in the dark. But I'll warn you, some of these places seem to know when someone's listening. The Appalachian Mountains are the oldest exposed range on the North American continent. Older than the Rockies, older than the Alps, older than the Himalayas. 480 million years, give or take a span of time that the human mind cannot meaningfully process. We say the number, but we don't feel it. We can't. Our species has been walking upright for a fraction of a percentage of the time these ridgelines have been standing. And in that time, the mountains have been worn down from peaks that may have rivaled the Himalayas to the low, rolling, fog-covered ridges we see today. They've been shaped by ice, by water, by the slow tectonic patience of a continent pulling itself apart and pressing back together. They've watched species rise and vanish. Entire ecosystems have bloomed and been erased in the time it took one of these ridges to lose 100 feet of elevation. I say this not to give you a geology lesson, but to establish a sense of scale, because the stories I'm about to tell you take place in a landscape that is incomprehensibly old. And when you spend enough time in that landscape, when you walk its hollows, its creek beds, its ridge lines, where the fog sits so thick you can lose your own hands, you start to feel the weight of that age. Not intellectually, physically, in your chest. In the way sound behaves. In the way distance seems to shift when you're not watching it. The Appalachian hollows, the locals say hollers, are where most of these stories live. A hollow is a narrow valley between two ridge lines, often carved by a creek, often so steep-sided that sunlight only reaches the bottom for a few hours a day. They are natural containers. Sound behaves strangely in them. A gunshot a mile away can sound like it's behind you. A voice from across the valley can arrive with perfect clarity, or not at all, swallowed by the geometry of the hills. Communities formed in these hollows because the soil at the bottom was good. The creek provided water. The ridges provided shelter from wind. But the hollows also isolated these communities in ways that are hard to appreciate from a modern vantage point. Before paved roads, before electricity, before the Rural Electrification Act of 1936, before telephone lines climbed the ridges, a family living in a deep Appalachian hollow might be a 2-hour walk from the nearest neighbor and a full day's travel from anything resembling a town. That isolation produced something. I'm careful about how I phrase this because I don't want to romanticize poverty or hardship, but the isolation produced communities that were self-contained in ways the modern world has almost entirely lost. They had their own traditions, their own medicines, their own songs, their own stories about what lived in the woods and what came out at night and what you did and didn't do when the fog came down. Some of those communities are well documented. Some of them appear in a single census record and then vanish. And some of them, the ones I'm going to tell you about, may never have been documented at all. Those are the ones that concern me. Not because they're frightening, though some of them are, but because their existence implies something about these mountains that I wasn't trained for and that I'm still, after everything, not sure I understand. The mountains remember. I'm increasingly certain of that. Whether they remember the way we do with narrative, with meaning, or whether they remember the way stone remembers pressure, I can't say, but something in the hollows keeps count, and something in the hollows keeps watch. The first story takes us back to that August afternoon in 2014, and I want to give you every detail I have because I've spent years trying to find the scene, the place where what I saw becomes explicable, and I haven't found it. I was conducting a routine watershed survey along a feeder creek about 9 miles off the Allegheny Trail in northern West Virginia. The work was standard measuring flow rates, noting erosion patterns, cataloging vegetation along the riparian buffer. The forest in that section is dense, a mix of old growth and secondary timber. The canopy so interlocked that at midday it feels like early evening. You walk through columns of muted green light, and the only way you know the sun is high is that the shadows have no direction. I'd been following the creek south for about 3 hours when the terrain did something my topographic map said it shouldn't. The map showed a gradual descent, a gentle slope over the next half-mile. What I encountered was a sharp fold in the landscape, almost bowl-shaped, as if something immense had pressed a thumb into the earth and twisted. The grade dropped steeply. The creek spilled down over mossy ledges, and at the bottom of that fold, maybe 300 feet below me, there was a valley that had no business being there. At the bottom of the valley were houses, not cabins, not hunting shacks, not the collapsing remains of a logging operation. Houses. Wood framed with covered porches, glass windows and tin roofs that caught the faint light filtering down from the canopy. They were maintained. The wood was weathered, but not rotten. The tin showed no rust holes. These were structures someone was caring for. I counted 7 from where I stood. There was an 8th structure, larger, set back from the others. It could have been a general store or a community hall. The kind of building you see in photographs of turn-of-the-century Appalachian settlements. There was a well with a hand pump, the iron dark and oiled. And there were gardens, squared off plots with what looked like late-season pole beans and field corn, the kind of varieties you see in heirloom seed catalogs, not modern commercial agriculture. I radioed my position and got static. That wasn't unusual. Deep valleys eat radio signals. The mountains fold the signal back on itself, and you can be half a mile from a repeater and get nothing. What was unusual was the silence. I need to describe this precisely because it's the detail that still unsettles me more than anything else. I'd been walking through active forest all morning, woodpeckers drilling, warblers calling, the constant living hum of insects, that baseline vibration of a healthy Appalachian forest in August that's so constant you stop hearing it until it stops. It stopped. Not gradually, not the way forest sound fades when a hawk passes over and the songbirds go quiet. It stopped as if it had been switched off. I took 2 more steps forward toward the edge of the valley, and the silence was absolute. Behind me, and I turned to confirm this, I could still hear the forest. Insects, a thrush, the creek. But ahead of me toward the village, there was nothing. No bird song and no insect noise. No wind in the leaves, though the leaves on the trees at the valley's edge were motionless in a way that felt chosen, as if the air itself had decided to hold still. I did not enter the village. I want to be clear about that because people have asked me over the years why I didn't walk down and knock on a door. The answer is that something in me, something that predates training, something I think every animal carries, recognized a boundary. Not a fence, not a sign, a threshold. And everything in my body said to stay on this side of it. I crouched beside a hickory tree at the tree line, and I watched. The clothes on the line were hand-sewn, not artisanal, not the kind of handmade clothes you buy at a craft fair. Functional, generational. The stitching patterns were the kind I'd seen in museums and textile collections from the mid-1800s. Long shirts, heavy trousers, a woman's dress with a hem that would reach the ground. The gardens were immaculate. The rows were straight. The soil between them was dark and recently worked. The paths between the houses were packed dirt. Swept clean, you could see the broom marks in a pattern that suggested daily maintenance. And the curtains moved. Every window I could see had a curtain white, or once white, cotton or linen. And as I watched, those curtains shifted, not all at once, one at a time. First the near house, then the house behind it, then the one to the left. A slow sequential movement, as if someone inside each house was taking a turn to look at the tree line, to look at me. Once I noticed the pattern, I timed it. Each curtain moved approximately 20 seconds after the last. 7 houses, 7 curtains. A full rotation took about 2.5 minutes. Then it started again. The same order, the same timing, over and over. I stayed for 40 minutes. I know this because I was writing in my field log the entire time, noting everything: the structure count, the garden layout, the well, the silence, the curtains. My hand was steady. My observations were clinical. But somewhere beneath the professional notation, a part of me was aware that I was being inventoried, not watched inventoried, as if something was recording my presence with the same methodical precision I was recording its village. When I left, I backed away from the tree line before turning. I don't know why I did that. I've never backed away from anything in the woods, but I did it that day. I marked a GPS waypoint. I noted the creek junction, the terrain features, the bearing from my last known position on the trail. I sketched the valley's shape in my field log, with measurements I estimated from the rim. 2 weeks later, I returned with a colleague, a man I'd worked with for 9 years. Steady, unimaginative in the best sense of the word, the kind of person who sees what's in front of him and doesn't add to it. We followed the same creek. We reached the same coordinates. My GPS confirmed we were standing within 15 feet of the waypoint I'd saved. There was nothing there. Not ruins, not foundations, not the faintest trace that anyone had ever built anything in that valley. The valley itself seemed shallower than I remembered, less pronounced, as if the earth had exhaled and flattened itself. The creek ran through without a fold. The forest was continuous. My colleague looked at the GPS, looked at the valley, and looked at me. He didn't say I was wrong. He didn't say I was crazy. He just said, "It's not here now." I still have that field log entry. The ink has faded in the years since, but the words are legible. 7 houses, gardens, clothes on a line, curtains moving in sequence, no people, no sound. Below that, in smaller handwriting, I added a line. I don't remember writing. They knew I was there, all of them, at the same time. I've never been able to explain what I saw below Bone Hollow, and I've reached the point where I've stopped trying. Some things don't want to be explained. They just want to be witnessed. And maybe that's what the curtains were doing, not hiding, witnessing me back. There's a census record from 1940 that lists a community called Martin Fork in the mountains of southwestern Virginia. Population 31. That number by itself means nothing. There were hundreds of small communities scattered through Appalachian hollows with populations in the 20s and 30s, places too small for a post office, too remote for a church circuit, too stubborn to relocate. 31 people in a hollow in Bland County, Virginia wouldn't raise an eyebrow. What raises an eyebrow is what the census taker wrote in the margin of his personal field notes, which I found in an archive in Roanoke in 2009. A single line, written in pencil, slightly smudged, as if his hand had trembled. The woman at the first house counted us as we arrived. She knew the exact number before we spoke. She said 31. That is also the number of graves. I need to give you context for why this disturbed me, because the fact itself sounds almost mundane. An old woman knows how many people live in her community. Of course she does. She's lived there her whole life. She can see the road. She counted the census team coming in. But that's not what Harold Denny, the census taker, is describing. He's describing something else. He's describing a woman who said the number 31 before she could have known what question he was there to answer, before he introduced himself, before the purpose of his visit was stated. She said the number is a greeting, as if the number was the only thing about her community that mattered to the outside world, and she wanted to get it out of the way. And she connected it immediately to the graves. Denny arrived at Martin Fork on a September morning in 1940 with a local guide, a mail carrier who knew the mountain roads and the communities they served. His notes describe a 2-hour walk from the nearest road passable by vehicle. The trail was narrow but well worn. The forest was thick second-growth oak and hickory, the kind that comes back after logging, which would have swept through that area in the 1880s or 90s. He noted the smell of wood smoke before they reached the settlement, which meant chimneys were active despite the mild weather. The woman was standing on the porch of the first house when they arrived. Elderly Denny estimated 70 or older, though in that era and that environment, hard living could add 20 years to a face. She was small, straight-backed, and still. She didn't wave. She didn't step forward. She stood and waited for them to approach. And when they were within speaking distance, she said the number. 31. Denny asked what she meant. She told him there were 31 people in Martin Fork. That was what he'd come to count, wasn't it? He confirmed it was. She told him he could save himself the walk. The number was 31. It had been 31 in 1930. It had been 31 in 1920. She said the number does not change. Not hasn't changed. Does not change. Denny recorded the distinction. He was a careful man. He counted anyway. He visited every household, 8 homes, surnames that repeated Combs, Suttles, Branham, the pattern of 3 or 4 families intermarrying over a century, the genetic and social knot that isolation ties. Occupations, farming, timbering, household, children, adults, elderly, all healthy, all quiet. All, Denny noted, seemingly aware that his count was a formality. The total was 31. His guide pointed out the graveyard on the walk between the 3rd and 4th houses. A clearing on a hillside. Wooden markers, most weathered smooth. A few with faint carved initials. The grass between them was kept short, grazed or scythed. Denny counted the markers. 31. He writes, and I can hear the discomfort in his phrasing, the formal hedging of a government employee who suspects he's documenting something irrational. I am aware this is likely coincidence. The graveyard is old and some markers have surely been lost to weather. But the woman's certainty was not the certainty of someone who had counted. It was the certainty of someone who knew a rule. Not a fact. A rule. As if the population of 31 wasn't a head count but a condition, a requirement, something that had to be maintained the way you maintain a fence line or a fire. I tried to find Martin Fork. The 1950 census has no listing for it, neither does 1960. Bland County land records show no property transfers for any of the surnames Denny recorded after 1940. The hollow itself exists. I've seen it on LiDAR elevation data, a narrow crease between 2 ridges, and there are faint geometric patterns visible in the data that are consistent with structural foundations. But the forest has taken it all back. Tulip, poplar, and red maple, the pioneer species, the first trees to reclaim a clearing. What I keep returning to is the implication. If the population was always 31, if it had been 31 for decades, through births and deaths and the ordinary arithmetic of human life, then the numbers had to balance. Someone born means someone gone. Someone arrives means someone leaves, or someone stops. I mentioned this to an older ranger who'd grown up in Bland County, a man who'd spent 70 years in those mountains, and spoke about them the way a monk speaks about a monastery with reverence and a certain watchful caution. He wasn't surprised by what I told him. He said there were stories about hollows where the numbers held, where the count stayed fixed, where the balance, as he put it, was corrected if it was disturbed. He said it the way you'd mentioned that a particular creek floods in April, not with alarm, with familiarity, with the understanding that some things in the mountains operate according to principles that were established long before anyone thought to question them. The 1930 census for Martin Fork also lists a population of 31. I've confirmed this. I was unable to locate the 1920 record. The archive had gaps. But if the woman was right, it would say the same. 31 living, 31 buried. A number that does not change. I think about that balance when I'm deep in the mountains and I come across a clearing where a homestead used to stand, where the daffodils still bloom in spring because they were planted 100 years ago and no one told them to stop. I stand in those clearings. And I wonder if the count is still running. If someone somewhere in the laurel thicket or the dark of a hollow I'll never find is still keeping the number where it needs to be. And I wonder what happens when it's off by one. This one begins with a sound. And I need to warn you, I've listened to the recording I'm about to describe more times than is probably healthy, and every time it produces the same physical reaction, a tightening in the chest, a sense that I'm hearing something I was not meant to hear. Not because it's forbidden, but because it's private, like overhearing a prayer through a wall. In 2011, a search and rescue volunteer in Potter County, Pennsylvania, recorded audio during a nighttime grid search near Kettle Creek. He was looking for a missing hiker, a 43-year-old man from Harrisburg who'd gone out for a solo weekend on the Susquehannock Trail system and hadn't returned. The volunteer's recorder was running as a matter of habit. He used it to document call-outs and environmental observations, the kind of meticulous practice that separates experienced SAR workers from enthusiasts. 16 minutes into the file, there is a sound that 3 separate audio analysts, 2 of them academics, 1 a forensic audio specialist, have independently described as coordinated human vocalization singing in unison from a location in the Pennsylvania wilderness where no structures exist, no residents live, and no road reaches. The missing hiker was never found. I need to take you to Kettle Creek to understand why this matters. Most people hear Pennsylvania and think cities, suburbs, rolling farmland. They don't think wilderness. But the northern tier, Potter County, Tioga, Cameron is as empty as anything in the deep South Appalachians. Entire townships with fewer than 50 people. State forest that runs unbroken for 20 miles in every direction. And in the hollows along Kettle Creek, a silence so complete it feels intentional. Not passive, not the absence of sound. A silence that seems enforced, as if the forest has agreed to be quiet and expects you to do the same. The hiker signed the trailhead register at Cross Fork on a Friday afternoon. By Monday, his car was still in the lot. The search launched that evening. Teams worked in pairs, sweeping outward from his last known position. On the second night, the volunteer I'll call Dan, because he asked me not to use his name, and I respect that, was working a section along a tributary of Kettle Creek. It was 11:15 at night, October. The temperature was in the mid-30s. He was standing in a creek bed resting, his headlamp pointed at the stones under his feet. His recorder was in his chest pocket, running. Dan didn't hear anything unusual in the moment. He was focused on his footing, on his breathing, on the protocol of the search. It was 2 days later, reviewing his recordings for his log, that he heard it. Begins faintly. A low, sustained tone, not mechanical, not insectoid, but voiced. A hum. Over the next 90 seconds, it builds. Additional tones layer in. Voices become distinguishable, not words, not a language anyone has identified, but individual human voices singing in a harmonic structure that is unmistakably deliberate. It rises and falls in phrases, it breathes. It pauses where a congregation would pause at the end of a verse, maybe, or between repetitions of something ancient and well-known. It sounds like a hymn, sung by a group of 15 to 20 people. And it is coming from a forested hollow where the nearest road is 7 miles of unbroken timber in every direction, and the nearest occupied dwelling is 12. Dan went back in daylight the next morning,
He followed the bearing as best he could estimate from his position in the creek bed. He found a clearing about a quarter-mile upstream, not a natural meadow. The trees had been cut, probably decades earlier. The stumps were still there, thigh-high, rotting slowly beneath moss and ferns. But the clearing itself was open.
It shouldn't have been. 50 years of Appalachian regrowth would have filled that space with saplings, with birch and aspen and hemlock. The clearing was empty, just grass, low and even, as if it were being grazed by animals that were no longer there. In the center of the clearing, stones were arranged in a rough rectangle. Dan estimated 20 feet by 40 feet, the size of a small church. The stones were local sandstone, weathered, partially sunken into the earth, but deliberately placed. Cornerstones, a foundation. Dan did not find the missing hiker. Nobody did. The search was suspended after 8 days. The man's body has never been recovered. His name is still on a missing persons list that has no leads and no suspects. I obtained the audio file from Dan in 2016. He sent me a digital copy with no conditions except that I not share it publicly. I've honored that. But I played it for 4 people, each time without telling them what to listen for. I just handed them headphones and said, "Tell me what you hear." All 4 described singing. One said it sounded old. I asked her what she meant by that, old voices, old recording. She thought about it and said, "No. Like the singing itself has been going on for a long time, not the recording, the song. Like it started before the recorder was turned on, like it's been going on for years." I checked historical records for that section of Kettle Creek. In the late 1800s, during the timber boom that stripped northern Pennsylvania to bare soil, a small group of seasonal workers established a camp in the drainage. They appear once in a foreman's letter from 1887 as a group that keeps to their own worship and does not welcome visitors to their services. The foreman notes, they are good workers but strange, and that they sing at night, and that the singing carries further than it ought. The settlement has no name in any record I've found. The workers appear in one letter and then vanish from the documentation, the way so many transient communities did in that era of extraction and abandonment. The stones in the clearing match the approximate footprint of a structure that would seat 15 to 20 people. The clearing feels, as Dan put it, attended to. Not maintained in a way you could point to no mower tracks, no tool marks, just not abandoned. As if the forest had been asked to keep its distance and had agreed to the terms. I still have the audio file. I listen to it sometimes, late at night when the house is quiet. The singing is beautiful. That's the part nobody talks about. It's not eerie, it's not discordant, it's beautiful the way water is beautiful, natural, unhurried, and completely indifferent to whether anyone is listening. But someone is listening. Dan's recorder proved that. And the clearing in the woods suggests that someone or something has been singing in that hollow for a very long time. Long enough that the trees have learned to leave room for it. Some things don't need an audience. They already have a congregation. I want to change the pace here. This story isn't about something I heard in the woods at night or a village that vanished. It's about a piece of paper in a county archive. A single paragraph in the meeting minutes of the Haywood County Board of Commissioners from March 1938. And it's about what that paragraph implies about a community's relationship with something on a ridge above them. When the Rural Electrification Act brought power lines into the mountains of western North Carolina in the late 1930s, it was transformative. Families that had lived by kerosene lamp and candle for generations suddenly had electric light. refrigeration, radio. Whole communities modernized in a matter of months. Every community in Haywood County accepted the service. Every community except one. The residents of a place called Delwood sent a delegation 3 men to the county seat to formally refuse electrical service. The minutes record their reason verbatim, the way a county clerk does when something is unusual enough to warrant exact language. The light would disturb what watches from the ridge. I need to clarify geography. The Delwood I'm referring to is not the modern community near Maggie Valley that currently bears the name. In Appalachia, place names migrate. They detach from their original location and reattach to whatever settlement grows up nearby. The original Delwood, the one in the 1938 county minutes, was a cluster of about 15 households in a narrow valley further west, closer to the Balsam Range. It existed in county records between roughly 1870 and 1951, and then it was gone. The name drifted east. The valley drifted into silence. The board accepted the refusal without discussion. That detail is important. They didn't argue. They didn't send someone to explain the benefits. They accepted it, moved to the next item on the agenda, and left a community of perhaps 60 or 70 people in the dark, voluntarily, as if the board understood something they chose not to put in the minutes. What they did put in the minutes in a handwritten marginal note, added later in different ink, was this: Powerline crew reported refusal to survey Delwood Road. 2 crewmen requested transfer. See incident file. I looked for the incident file. The county archivist told me it was likely among the records destroyed in a basement flood in the 1970s. Maybe it was. Or maybe it was filed somewhere. No one wants to look. In 2014, I spoke with a retired lineman in a care facility in Waynesville. He was 93. His memory was precise, in the way that very old memories become the details burnished by decades of recollection, until they're sharper than the present. He hadn't worked the Delwood job, but he remembered the crew that had. He remembered what they looked like when they came back. White as paper, he said, and wouldn't talk about it. One of them quit the next week. Just turned in his belt and went home to Asheville. The other one he stayed on, but he wouldn't drive that road again. Not for double pay, not for anything. I asked the lineman what the general understanding was among the crews. What had happened on the road to Delwood? He was quiet for a long time. He looked at the window of his room where afternoon light came in through thin curtains, and he said, "Some of the old places up there, they had arrangements with the land, with what's on it. You don't bring electric light into a place that has an arrangement with the dark." He wouldn't elaborate. I didn't press. At 93, a man has earned the right to his silences. I hiked into the area where original Delwood should have been in 2015, using a combination of county plat maps from the 1890s and USGS quad sheets from the 1940s. The valley is there narrow, steep-sided, the creek at the bottom running cold and clear over a bed of smooth stones. I found foundation remnants from at least 4 structures. A collapsed root cellar, lined with hand-laid fieldstone, and in the remains of what was probably a communal well, the stones still arranged in a neat circle around a dark shaft that I could not see the bottom of. The forest had reclaimed everything. Tulip, poplar, sourwood, Fraser magnolia, the trees that come first after abandonment, filling the light gaps, lacing their roots through the old foundations. I've seen this before. It's the natural process.
The mountains take back what we stopped defending, but the ridge, the eastern ridge above the valley, has a bald on it, a treeless area, maybe 2 acres, covered in grass and low shrubs. Balds are common in the southern Appalachians. Their origins are genuinely mysterious. Some may have been maintained by grazing elk or bison, some by fire, some by native peoples for ceremonial or agricultural purposes. Science has not settled the question. But this bald was different. The grass was uniform, not meadowgrass with its uneven heights and mixed species. Uniform. A single species, the same height everywhere, as if it had been mowed that morning. And in the center of the bald, there was a depression, not a sinkhole, nothing dramatic. A shallow basin, roughly circular, about 30 feet across. The grass in the basin was the same height as the grass around it. But the ground felt different underfoot, denser, more resonant. As if there were a hollow space beneath it that extended further down than the topsoil should allow. I stood at the edge of that basin and experienced something I do not have professional vocabulary for. It was not fear. Fear is a reaction to a perceived threat, and nothing was threatening me. It was the acute awareness of being perceived, not watched, perceived. As if something was aware, not just of my location, but of my composition, my weight, my temperature, my intent. The contents of my pockets, the history behind my eyes. I felt cataloged. I left the valley before dark. I've been in the backcountry at night hundreds of times. I've slept alone in places where the nearest road was a day's walk. That afternoon, in that valley, under that ridge, I did not want to be there when the light failed. Because the light was what the people of Delwood had said would cause the disturbance. They refused it to maintain peace with whatever watched from the ridge. And if the absence of electric light was part of the arrangement, I didn't want to find out what happened when the only remaining light, the daylight itself, went away. The original Delwood stopped appearing in records after 1951. The families didn't relocate to neighboring communities. They didn't appear in other counties. They simply stopped being documented, the way a word drops out of a language not because the thing it described ceased to exist, but because people stopped wanting to say it aloud. And the ridge bald is still there. I've checked satellite imagery annually since 2016. It has not changed. The grass is always the same height. The basin is always the same depth. No erosion, no encroachment, no growth, no change. In a decade of photographs, not a single pixel has shifted, as if something is maintaining it, or as if it was never really grass at all. This story was told to me by a retired Army Corps of Engineers project manager at a diner in Pikeville, Kentucky, in 2017. He'd heard I was interested in communities that exist outside official records, and he'd contacted me through a mutual acquaintance. I'll call him Bill. He was in his late 70s, sharp-eyed, methodical in his speech, and visibly uncomfortable with what he was about to describe. He kept stirring his coffee even after the sugar was dissolved. His spoon went around and around in the cup the entire time he talked, as if the rhythm of it was keeping something at bay. In 1965, the Corps planned to flood a valley in eastern Kentucky for a reservoir project, part of the broader flood control initiative along the Upper Cumberland drainage. These projects were common in mid-century Appalachia. You dammed a narrow point, flooded the valley behind it, and relocated the residents to higher ground. The environmental and human costs were enormous, but the engineering was straightforward. 47 households were identified, notified, compensated, and relocated.
Structures were demolished or left to be submerged. Roads were regraded. The valley was ready for water. Final walkthrough, done. Except, during the final engineering survey, a team followed a tributary into a side valley that wasn't part of the main project area but fell within the calculated flood pool boundary. It was a routine check, making sure nothing had been missed. They found a community of approximately 20 people living in a cluster of log and frame structures, gardens in neat rows, livestock chickens, a few goats, a smokehouse with the faint sweet smell of curing meat, a one-room schoolhouse with a bell mounted on a post outside, a functioning, organized, self-sustaining settlement that was about to be drowned. And it was not on any map, any property record, any census, any relocation list. Bill told me the survey team leader radioed back to the project office and was, in Bill's words, incoherent with panic. Missing an entire community was not a minor bureaucratic error. It was a potential legal catastrophe. Families drowned because the Corps didn't know they were there. A relocation team went in the next day. The residents were cooperative. They answered questions, but they were vague in ways that Bill described as not evasive, empty. They said they'd been there always. When asked for surnames, they gave names that matched no regional families. When asked for documentation, birth certificates, social security numbers, land deeds, they had none. The children were healthy but had never attended any school outside the community. The adults spoke English but with an accent that Bill described as Appalachian but displaced, as if the dialect had evolved along a branch that diverged a long time ago. He said it was like hearing someone speak a language, from a room you've never been in. When the relocation team explained that the valley was going to be flooded, the residents nodded. They said they knew. They'd been told they could stay. By whom? They wouldn't answer. They just repeated the phrase calmly, without variation. We were told we could stay. Emergency relocation paperwork was processed. Temporary housing was arranged in a nearby town. The residents were transported out by truck. Bill said they boarded quietly, almost passively, carrying nothing. The team had told them they could bring personal belongings, clothes, tools, photographs, whatever mattered to them. They brought nothing. They sat in the truck with their hands in their laps and looked straight ahead, as if they were passengers on a trip whose destination they already knew. Within a week, every one of them was gone from the temporary housing. Not dramatically, no broken locks, no nighttime departures. They simply weren't there when the caseworkers came by. The housing units were clean. The beds were made. It was as if they'd been unoccupied all along. No one in town remembered seeing them leave. No one could clearly remember seeing them arrive. The valley was flooded on schedule. Years later, during a drought that lowered the reservoir to levels not seen since its creation, Bill was on a boat survey of the exposed lake bed. He could see the remains of the main settlement, the collapsed structures, the stone walls of the old gardens, the road beds, all of it preserved in the cold. Still water like a photograph of a life interrupted. But in the side valley where the unregistered community had lived, there was nothing. No foundations, no walls, no evidence that any structure had ever been built there. The mud was smooth and undisturbed. The tributary flowed through as if the valley had been empty since the Devonian. It was like they took the whole place with them, Bill said. His spoon stopped moving. He stared into his coffee. Wherever they went. I searched for corroborating records. The main valley relocation list exists 47 households, all named, all accounted for, all compensated. The side valley community appears nowhere. The emergency relocation paperwork Bill described has no corresponding file in any archive I've been able to access. Either it never existed, or it was removed so thoroughly that the gap itself is invisible. 47 households were moved. The valley was flooded. And somewhere, a community that was never officially there continues to not officially be anywhere. I think about them sometimes, the way they sat on that truck with nothing in their hands, looking straight ahead. They knew the water was coming. They said they'd been told they could stay. And when they were forced to leave, they dissolved into the ordinary world as if they'd never been part of it. Maybe they hadn't been. In September 2019, 2 thru hikers on the Cumberland Trail in Tennessee posted a series of photographs on a backpacking forum I follow. 11 photographs in total. They showed a small village, maybe 10 buildings, in a hollow they'd stumbled into after losing the blazes in a section where storm damage had rearranged the canopy. The post was articulate, detailed, not sensational. They described the village with the precision of experienced hikers, noting the construction materials, the layout, the absence of power lines, the quality of the paths. They described it the way you describe an unexpected historical site. The post went viral briefly, the way things do on small forums, shared, discussed, screenshotted. Then it was deleted. The accounts were deactivated. And the thing that made people screenshot it before it disappeared was the 11th photograph, the last one, taken through a window of what appeared to be a one-room schoolhouse. On the chalkboard in handwriting that was neat, almost typographic, evenly spaced, unhurried, someone had written a single sentence. "You are not the first to find us. You will not remember." I saved to the post. I have screenshots on a hard drive. The hikers, a couple in their 30s from Knoxville, had been section hiking between Grassy Cove and the Obed River when they lost the trail. They followed a drainage downhill, expecting to intersect a road or a creek crossing they could use to reorient. Instead, they descended into what one of them described as a town that time skipped over. The photographs show small frame buildings, unpainted but structurally sound. A well with a rope and bucket. A structure with a narrow steeple, but no cross a meeting house maybe, or something that served a similar function by a different name, and the schoolhouse with its chalkboard visible through glass that was clean and unbroken. The unsettling quality of the photographs is not in what they show, it's in what they don't. There are no people visible, no animals. But there are signs of immediate recent activity. A bucket by the well with water still in it, catching a reflection of sky. A broom leaning against a porch rail at an angle that suggests someone set it down moments ago. A garden with soil that has been turned so recently, the earth is dark and wet. The entire community looked like a place in the middle of a normal day from which every living thing had simultaneously stepped away. As if the village had emptied itself in the time between the hikers cresting the ridge and reaching the first building. As if it had heard them coming. I reached out to the hikers through a mutual contact in the Knoxville hiking community. I received a single reply. We'd rather not discuss it. We went back and couldn't find it. Please don't contact us again. That reply bothered me more than the photographs. Not the refusal, people are entitled to their silence, but the tone, the finality. These were experienced, curious people
who'd cared enough to photograph and document what they found, who'd posted about it publicly, who'd wanted answers. Something between the post and the reply had changed their minds. Something had made them want distance. I hiked the section they described in 2020. I brought detailed maps, a GPS unit, and a methodical grid pattern designed to cover every drainage in the area. I found the route they likely followed. The same ridge profile was visible in the background of one of their photographs, and I matched it to the terrain. I found old-growth forest. I found terrain consistent with the images. I did not find a village. What I found about 2 miles south of where I estimated the settlement should be was a survey marker. Cast iron, driven into a boulder with enough force to crack the stone around it. The text read, Cumberland Switch property of U. The name after of had been chiseled away, not weathered, not corroded, deliberately removed by someone with a cold chisel and a hammer. The marks were precise. The effort was intentional. Someone had claimed that land, named it, and then unmade the claim. Cumberland Switch appears in no Tennessee historical database I've searched. It's not a railroad term associated with this region. It's not a community name in any county record, any census, and any map. It exists only on that survey marker, and if the hiker's account is accurate, somewhere in a hollow that shows itself to lost travelers and then folds back into the ridgeline. I spent years thinking about that chalkboard. You are not the first to find us. That's a statement of pattern. That's a community that has been discovered before by others and has come to expect it. You will not remember. That's either a threat, a promise, or a description of what normally happens to the people who stumble in. The hikers remembered. They remembered well enough to take photographs and post them publicly, but then they went back and couldn't find the village, and they went quiet. Whatever the chalkboard was describing, whatever usually happens to the people who find Cumberland Switch, it didn't fully work on them. Or maybe it did, and what they remember isn't what actually happened. I held that survey marker. I ran my fingers over the chisel marks where a name had been erased. That's not folklore. That's iron and stone and the physical evidence of something that wanted to exist and then wanted very badly to be forgotten. I want to slow down here because this story requires a different kind of attention. It's not about isolation or vanishing communities. It's about what's underneath. Elkinsville, Indiana, was a real town, founded in the 1830s. Brown County Hill Country, southern Indiana, geologically and culturally the western edge of Appalachia, where the hills flatten out, but the hollows still hold their shadows, and the people still speak with a cadence that echoes the mountains 300 miles east. The town peaked at around 200 residents, declined slowly through the early 20th century, and was finally killed by progress in the early 1960s when the Army Corps of Engineers dammed Salt Creek and flooded the valley for Lake Monroe. The residents were relocated. The buildings were abandoned to the rising water. Elkinsville sank. It's visible during extreme drawdowns, drought years when the lake drops low enough to expose the old town like a wound reopening. Foundations emerge. Road beds appear. The outline of the community surfaces from the silt. And for a few weeks, you can walk through a ghost town that spends most of its existence underwater. In 2008, the lake dropped to levels not seen since its creation. The old town emerged more fully than it ever had. A park maintenance crew was dispatched to
survey the exposed area for safety hazards, standard procedure when submerged structures break the surface. The crew chief, I'll call him Marcus, found what everyone expected. The remains of Elkinsville, foundations, walls, the grid of the old streets. It matched the historical photographs. It matched the maps. It was exactly what it should have been. And then he found what was underneath it. Beneath the known foundations, exposed by the unusually low water and decades of erosion, there was a second layer of construction. Stone foundations older than the 1830s structures above them, arranged not in the rectangular grid of the later town, but in a semicircle. A deliberate arc of fitted stonework, mortarless. The joints so precise that a knife blade wouldn't pass between them. Marcus, who'd spent 20 years in park maintenance and had seen every kind of historical construction the region had to offer, compared the technique to dry stack masonry he'd seen in photographs of Neolithic European sites. It was that refined. It was that alien to the region. At the center of the semicircle, partially buried in lakebed mud that smelled of clay and something faintly metallic, there was a stone slab, approximately 8 feet by 4 feet, flat, heavy, and hinged. The hinge mechanism was corroded beyond function. Marcus couldn't tell if it was iron or something else, but the engineering intent was unmistakable. This slab was designed to be opened. It was a door, set flat in the ground, meant to be lifted. Marcus did not open it. He told me this in 2019 at a parks conference where I was giving a talk. He'd never filed an official report. He said he didn't know how to write it up without sounding like he'd been drinking on the job. But he also said, and this is the part he was reluctant to share, the part he told me only after we'd been talking for an hour and he'd decided I wasn't going to laugh, that when he knelt beside the slab, he could hear something beneath it. Not water, not the settling of mud. A low, rhythmic vibration. Slow, steady, organic. He said it sounded like a heartbeat, but slower. Much slower. A beat every 15 or 20 seconds, maybe. As if something down there was alive, but operating on a timescale that had nothing to do with human biology. Decades between breaths. Centuries between thoughts. Marcus photographed the stone foundations and the slab. He returned the next day to find the lake had risen 6 inches overnight. A sudden and unusual reversal during what was otherwise a sustained drought. The slab was already submerged. Within a week, the entire Elkinsville site was back underwater. The drought broke without meteorological explanation. He shared the photographs with an archaeology professor at Indiana University. The professor examined them and told Marcus that the stone construction was inconsistent with any known indigenous or colonial building tradition in the region. The professor asked to visit the site. Marcus told him it was underwater. The professor said to contact him when it surfaced again. It hasn't. Lake Monroe has not returned to 2008 levels. The old Elkinsville sits beneath the water, and beneath Elkinsville, the older settlement sits in the dark, arranged in its careful semicircle around a door that someone built. And someone else, perhaps the same someone, chose to cover with a town. I think about the people who founded Elkinsville in the 1830s. They built their homes on top of something ancient. Did they know? Was that the point? Were they guarding the door? Were they there to make sure it stayed closed? A community-sized paperweight on whatever breathed beneath the mud? Or were they feeding it? And if they were, what happened when they left? The water keeps its secrets. And it came back, as Marcus noted, faster than it should have. As if something beneath the lake bed preferred the dark. As if the door was not meant to be seen. As if the whole lake, the whole reservoir, the whole engineered flood was just the latest in a long series of coverings. Dirt, then stone, then a town, then water, each one heavier than the last. As if whatever is down there keeps almost waking up, and the world keeps finding new ways to put it back to sleep. I need to give you the daylight version of this place before I give you the dark. Hensley Settlement sits on top of Brush Mountain in the Cumberland Gap National Historical Park, on the border of Virginia and Kentucky. It was established in 1903 by a man named Sherman Hensley, a farmer who hauled his family and his ambitions up a mountain and built a community from scratch. At its peak, maybe 30 people lived up there. They farmed, they raised livestock, they educated their children in a one-room schoolhouse, and they lived a life that was, by the time they were living it, already a century out of step with the lowland world. The last residents left in 1947. Sherman stayed alone until 1951. 4 more years by himself on a mountaintop, maintaining a community of one, walking the same paths, tending the same gardens, performing the daily routines of a life that everyone else had already moved on from. The Park Service maintains it now as a living history site. 12 homestead cabins, a schoolhouse, a blacksmith shop, a barn, split rail fencing. You can drive up the mountain in a 4-wheel drive van and walk through it. And if you go on a quiet day, the weight of the lives that were lived there settles on your shoulders like a coat you didn't put on. It is one of the most atmospheric places in the Appalachian region. I've been there half a dozen times, always during the day. I did not know until 2017 that the Park Service had a persistent staffing problem with overnight security assignments at the settlement. The ranger who told me I'll call her Sarah was one of 4 seasonal employees assigned to rotate overnight shifts during the 2016 visitor season. The job was straightforward. Stay at the settlement from sunset to sunrise. Watch for vandals or trespassers. File a report in the morning. By August, Sarah was the only one of the 4 who hadn't requested a transfer. The first night was quiet. Stars over Brush Mountain, the sound of wind in the chestnut oaks, crickets, normal. The second night, she noticed a light in the window of the Hensley house, the main residence, the patriarch's home. She assumed a reflection, moonlight. The headlights of a car on a distant road catching the glass at an angle. She walked over and checked. The window was dark. She returned to her vehicle. The third night, the light was back. Warmer this time, yellower. It moved within the house, from the front room to the back, and then to the second floor the way a lantern would if someone were carrying it from room to room. Sarah radioed the park dispatcher. They confirmed no one was authorized to be at the settlement. She approached the house with her flashlight drawn. The light went out before she reached the porch. Not faded, out, as if extinguished, or as if whatever was carrying it had set it down and waited for her to pass. Over subsequent nights, the activity accumulated. She heard the rhythmic clang of metal on metal from the blacksmith shop, the distinctive sound of a hammer shaping iron on an anvil. She heard chickens clucking softly from the direction of a coop that hasn't held chickens in 70 years. She heard a woman's voice from inside the schoolhouse reading aloud. The words were indistinct, absorbed by the log walls, but the cadence was unmistakable. It was a lesson.
rising inflection at the end of questions, pauses for student response. Someone was teaching, but the detail that stayed was Sarah. The one that made her lock the doors of her truck and sit rigid from 3 a.m. until the sky began to lighten. Footsteps on the Hensley house porch. They followed a pattern. Out the front door, she heard the creak of the hinges, the particular squeal of that particular door. Across the porch to the right. Down the steps, 3 of them, she counted the sounds. Across the yard toward the barn. A pause. Then back. The same route, the same rhythm, the same duration every night. Sarah researched Sherman Hensley. She found a descendant living in Middlesboro who'd known the old man as a child. The descendant told her that Sherman's morning routine was invariant for the last 50 years of his life. Out the front door, across the porch to the right, down the steps, to the barn to check the livestock, pause, back, every morning, for 50 years, without deviation. Sarah was hearing a dead man's daily routine, performed in the dark, 65 years after he'd last walked that path. Not a recording, not a memory, a continuation. As if Sherman Hensley had not stopped his routine when he left the mountain. As if he had not stopped at all. She completed her assignment, she didn't transfer. When I asked her why, expecting her to say something about courage or professionalism, she said something I've thought about on every quiet night since. It wasn't threatening, it was just continuing, like the settlement doesn't know it's empty, or doesn't agree that it is. I confirmed her account with 2 other rangers who'd worked overnight at Hensley. Both described similar phenomena: lights, sounds, the pervasive sense of activity in buildings that their flashlights proved were empty. One of them described the experience as shift change. The feeling that a crew was arriving for work and you were the one who didn't belong. That the settlement was the permanent thing and you were the temporary visitor, tolerated but not included. The Park Service doesn't publicize any of this. They don't deny it either. Seasonal ranger reports from Hensley are noted and filed. No investigations are conducted. No explanations are offered. The settlement continues. The routines persist. The lantern light moves through rooms where no lantern exists, and somewhere on Brush Mountain, a man who's been dead since the Eisenhower administration walks out his front door, crosses his porch, and goes to check on livestock that left the barn 7 decades ago. Because some things don't stop when the living do. Some things are older than the people who perform them. I need you to approach this one like a puzzle, because the data is real and the data does not make sense. There is a topographic anomaly in the mountains of Letcher County, eastern Kentucky, that has been documented by 3 separate United States Geological Survey campaigns over the past 80 years. A hollow, a small valley between 2 ridgelines that does not remain in the same location on sequential maps. The 1940 survey places it approximately 2 miles north of its 1970 position. The 2003 digital elevation survey places it approximately 1 mile further east. The ridge lines around it are stable. The creeks are where they should be. The geology is fixed. The hollow moves. I discovered this in 2012 while cross-referencing historical survey maps for a trail planning project. I was overlaying 3 generations of topographic quadrangles, 1940, 1970, and 2003, and checking them against modern satellite imagery. Everything aligned except one feature. A narrow, steep-sided hollow that appeared in all 3 surveys, but occupied a different position in each. The hollow is labeled on the 1940 map with a community name I'm going to call Carver Branch. because I'm not comfortable publishing the real one. The survey notes indicate a small settlement of approximately 10 structures. The 1970 map shows Carver Branch, 2 miles south-southeast, with the same number of structures. The 2003 digital elevation model shows the terrain feature the hollow itself, with its characteristic shape, 1 mile east of the 1970 position. The community name does not appear on the 2003 survey, but the landform is there. The logical explanation is mapping error. Early surveys in Appalachian terrain had significant margins of error. The instruments were imprecise, the vegetation was dense, the ridge lines were confusing. Different teams, using different methods, could easily misplace a feature by a mile or two. I accepted this explanation until I spoke with a retired surveyor who'd worked the 1970 quadrangle. He was in his 80s, living in Whitesburg, and he had the quiet precision of a man who'd spent his career measuring the world to the inch. When I showed him the discrepancy on a printout, he went still, not surprised, not confused. Still. The way a person goes still when you mention something they've spent decades deciding not to discuss. Then he told me about the warning. His team lead had pulled them aside before they entered that section of the survey area. Based on conversations with local people, he didn't say who they were, instructed to survey the hollow from the ridgeline. They were not to descend into it. They were to measure it from above, note it, and move on. They complied. The team lead had also told them that the 1940 survey crew had received the same warning, and that the 1940 crew had not complied. They'd gone in. "How many on the 40 crew?" I asked. "5, he said. "And?" "4 came back." The 5th man's disappearance was attributed to a fall, one of the mundane tragedies of fieldwork in rough terrain. The body was reportedly never recovered. The details were discussed quietly among USGS field teams for decades, one of those stories that circulates within a profession, but never makes it into a written report. A cautionary tale that everyone knows and no one cites. The retired surveyor told me one more thing. When his team surveyed from the ridgeline in 1970, they could see structures in the hollow below. Not the same structures depicted in the 1940 survey. Different buildings, different arrangement, different materials, but the same count. Approximately 10. Different community, same number, same hollow, different position on the map. I pulled the 2003 digital elevation data and studied the hollow's current apparent position. Using satellite imagery, I found a faint canopy gap consistent with a small clearing, regular, maintained, the kind of gap that doesn't occur naturally in mature Appalachian forest. I could not make out individual structures, but something was there. Something was keeping the trees from closing in. I did not go to Letcher County. There is a point, and I've crossed it many times in this line of work, where curiosity becomes something else. The warning that passed between survey teams across 3 generations, the specific instruction to stay on the ridgeline, to observe but not enter, is not a dare. It's a boundary. The kind that's maintained not by fences but by consequences. A man went in 1940 and didn't come back. The hollow moved. A new community appeared, the same count. I'll leave you with that arithmetic and let you work out the implications on your own. The next major USGS survey of that quadrangle is scheduled for 2028. I'm curious to see where the hollow shows up, and I'm curious whether the count is still 10, or whether it's 11, the original 10, plus a surveyor who descended into a valley 88 years ago and never climbed back out.
I want this one to feel different. The other stories have been about discovery, about finding places that shouldn't exist. This one is about a place that everyone knows about and nobody talks about. A place that is, in the most unsettling sense of the word, local. There's a road outside Maryville, Tennessee. It has an official route number and everything that locals call the back road. If you follow it past the last marked intersection, past where the pavement deteriorates to gravel and the gravel narrows to dirt, past the point where your cell signal drops to zero and the trees close overhead like a tunnel, you'll reach a fork. The fork is not on any GPS navigation system. It does not appear on Google Maps. It does not appear on the USGS quadrangle. But it is there, a physical divergence in the road, one branch going right and one going left, as real as the steering wheel in your hands. The right fork loops back to the paved road within a few miles. I know because I've taken it. The left fork goes somewhere else. I went left once, in 2012. Out of a curiosity I've since learned to manage. The community at the end of the left fork consists of approximately a dozen structures in a valley that felt, when I entered it, like crossing a threshold between two versions of the world. The air changed. It became cooler or denser, or both. I lack the precise word for it. The ambient sound shifted. The same forest surrounded me, but it had become a version of itself that was paying attention. Forest with its eyes open. The people I met were courteous in a way that felt procedural, not warm, not cold, correct. As if hospitality were a protocol that had been followed so many times it had worn smooth, like a stone step in a church doorway. An older woman brought me a glass of water without being asked. She appeared on the porch of the nearest house with it in her hand, as if she'd known I was coming before I'd known I was going. A man in his 50s answered my questions in short, precise sentences. Yes, they'd been there a long time. No, they didn't have electricity. No, they didn't want it. Yes, they knew about Maryville. They went there sometimes, for supplies. I asked how many people lived in the community. He considered this. Not the way you consider a question you need to count the answer to. The way you consider a question that has more than one correct answer, depending on conditions. It depends on the time of day, he said. The woman with the water glass looked at me when he said it, and her expression shifted to something I can only describe as genuine maternal concern. Not for herself, for me. You should leave before sundown, she said. The others come out at dark, and they don't know you yet. I asked who the others were. She shook her head, not refusing, but reaching for words that weren't there, or that she'd been taught not to use with outsiders. The man said, "They're from further back in the valley, further back in time, further back in something that doesn't have a name in English." He didn't clarify, and the conversation was over. Not because he ended it, because the air ended it. A shift in the quality of the silence that made continuing feel like trespass. I left at 4 p.m. The sun was still high. The drive back to the fork took 10 minutes. I went right. Pavement within 20 minutes. Cell signal. The membrane was behind me. I told the Blount County Sheriff's deputy about my experience. He nodded the way you nod when someone confirms something you've known since childhood. He told me his department had an informal, unwritten policy regarding the community on the left fork. They do not patrol there. If no one calls for help, they don't go in. He said this policy was older than he was. Older than his predecessor, older probably than the department itself. What happens at night? I asked. He gave me a look that was half amusement and half something much older. The population changes. The man in the valley said the same thing in different words. It depends on the time of day. During the daylight hours, you see a small, quiet community of people who grow food and carry water and live without electricity and keep to themselves. They are real. They cast shadows. They offer you water. At night, the population supplements. Something from further back joins them, something that the woman felt I needed to be warned about, not because it was malicious, but because it didn't know me. The way a dog doesn't know a stranger, not hostile, unacquainted, and in that state, unpredictable. I've driven past the back road fork a dozen times since 2012. I've never gone left again. Not because I was threatened, not because I was forbidden, but because the woman's concern was real. She wasn't performing. She wasn't trying to add mystery to her community. She was trying to keep me safe from something she lived alongside and had learned, over what might have been a very long time, to accommodate. The others come out at dark. I don't know what that means. But the people who do know have made their peace with it in a way that I am not equipped to understand. And I think the reason nobody talks about the left fork, the reason the sheriff's department doesn't patrol there, the reason the GPS doesn't show the turn, is that the accommodation extends outward. The community has an arrangement, not just with the others, with everyone, with the whole county, with the map itself. Leave us alone during the day, don't come at all at night, and we'll keep them where they are, further back. I want to approach this one with care, because Sago is not a folklore motif, it is a wound. On January 2nd, 2006, an explosion ripped through the Sago mine in Upshur County, West Virginia. 12 miners died. One survived, Randall McCloy Jr., who was pulled from the mine alive after spending more than 40 hours in conditions that should have been unsurvivable. The disaster and its aftermath are well documented. The miscommunication, the agonizing, cruel, false report that all 13 miners had survived, followed by the correction that 12 were dead, is one of the most painful moments in the history of American mining. What I'm about to describe does not appear in any news report. It exists in the peripheral space around the event, in the accounts of people who were there, in the Sago Baptist Church, waiting for news during the longest night of their lives. I spoke with 3 residents of the Sago area over several years. They came to me separately through different channels. None of them knew I'd spoken to the others. All 3 described the same thing. When the explosion occurred, families gathered at the church to wait. Sago Baptist Church is small, capacity of about 120. It filled quickly. People stood along the walls. The media set up their lights and cameras outside. Hours passed. The community held its breath. All 3 of my sources described becoming aware, at different points during the vigil, of people in the back pews whom they did not recognize. In a community that small, you know everyone. You know faces, you know gaits. You know the way people sit in church, which pew, which side, which angle. These were strangers, but they were not behaving like strangers. They were weeping. They were praying. They were saying the names of the trapped miners. First names, nicknames, names that the news anchors outside didn't know yet, names that only family and crew partners would use. One of my sources told me a woman in the back row was repeating the name Martin Toller Jr., one of the 12 who died. But she wasn't saying it the way a news viewer would, with the detached pity of distance. She was saying it the way family says a name, with weight, with ownership, with the kind of grief that comes from having known someone since before they were a person, since they were just a possibility in a family line. My source moved toward the woman. A commotion at the door distracted her, the first rumor of survivors, the one that turned out to be wrong, the one that briefly lit the church with false hope before extinguishing it. When she looked back, the woman was gone. The pew was empty. The seat was cold. The second source described a man in the back corner, middle-aged, wearing work clothes that looked like mine gear but not modern gear. Older, heavier fabric. The kind of equipment you see in photographs from the 1930s and 40s, when mine safety meant a hard hat and a prayer. The man sat and rocked slowly, the way you rock when grief has become physical, when your body takes over the work your mind can't do. The third source said simply, there were people there who came to grieve, and they weren't from here, but they knew our people. They knew them better than the reporters outside. When the confirmation came, when the truth replaced the lie, when 12 dead replaced 13 alive, the church collapsed into the kind of grief that erases observation. Screaming, people falling, the sound a community makes when it breaks. And in that chaos, the strangers in the back pews were no longer there. They didn't leave. They weren't seen going. They were simply absent. The way a candle flame is absent after you blow it out, present, and then not, with nothing in between. No one reported this to the media. It would have been lost in the enormity of the tragedy anyway. And in the days that followed, the strangeness of it was absorbed into the larger strangeness of sudden, violent loss. The mind in grief is not a reliable instrument, and every one of my sources acknowledged this freely. But they maintained, years later, with the calm conviction of people who have finished doubting themselves, that what they saw was real. Strangers in the pews, dressed in clothes from another era, weeping for men they seemed to know, and then gone. I've thought about this in the context of what Appalachian mining communities are. The coal industry has been killing men in these mountains for over a century. The dead accumulate. Generation after generation, the same families send their sons into the same darkness, and some of those sons don't come out. The mines create the dead, the communities carry them, the churches hold the grief, the pews absorb it. And maybe on the worst night, when the explosion happens and the families gather and the grief is so dense it warps the air, maybe the dead come to carry the community. Maybe they come back to the pews where they once sat and prayed for their own friends, their own fathers, their own sons. Maybe they grieve alongside the living, because the living and the dead in a mining community have never been as separate as we pretend. I don't present this as fact. I present it as what 3 people told me independently, with no reason to fabricate and nothing to gain. I believe they believe it. And I believe the pews at the back of the Sago Baptist Church have held 100 years of grieving families. If those pews could speak, I think they tell you that the congregation is always larger than anyone counts. This one is different. No vanishing village, no ghostly figures, no impossible census, just stones, just trees, just silence, and a boundary that enforces itself. I found the first stone in 2010 during a routine survey near the Black Fork of Cheat River in the Monongahela National Forest. It was partially buried in leaf litter at the base of an eastern hemlock, a flat piece of sandstone about the size of a loaf of bread.
I assumed it was a historical property marker. Old boundaries in the Appalachians are often marked with stones carved, notched, or simply placed at intervals by surveyors or landowners whose names have been forgotten for a century. What stopped me was the carving. A vertical line intersected by 3 horizontal lines of decreasing length, the shortest at the top, creating something that looked like a simplified tree, or an arrow pointing down, or a symbol for something I had no reference for. I found the second stone 80 feet further along my survey line. Same stone type, same size, same symbol, then a third, a fourth. Over the next 2 days, as my route curved through the forest, I mapped 17 of them, each positioned at approximately the same interval, each bearing the same mark, carved with the same technique at the same depth. They formed a circle, a rough, slightly irregular circle encompassing an area I estimated at 40 acres. And inside that circle, the forest was wrong. I don't mean dead, I don't mean diseased, I mean wrong. Outside the perimeter of stones, the forest was standard Allegheny hardwood red oak, sugar maple yellow birch, black cherry canopy trees reaching 80 to 90 feet, the kind of mature forest you expect in a protected national forest, dense, tall, normal. Inside the perimeter, nothing exceeded 3 feet. Saplings, shrubs, ferns, ground cover, all healthy, all green, all growing vigorously, and all stunted at the same height. 3 feet, give or take a few inches. It was as if someone had placed a glass ceiling over those 40 acres and the forest had grown up to it and stopped. I've encountered stunted growth before. Unusual soil chemistry can do it. Serpentine barrens, acid bogs, extreme microclimatic conditions on exposed ridges. But the boundary was too precise. It followed the stone perimeter exactly. I tested this. I stood at one of the stones with 1 foot inside the circle and 1 foot outside. The fern touching my right boot was 3 feet tall. The red oak touching my left shoulder was 85 feet tall. The transition was a step. I brought a Forest Service archaeologist to the site in 2011. She examined 6 of the stones and confirmed that the carving technique was consistent with pre-contact indigenous stonework, several hundred years old at minimum, possibly much older. The symbol matched nothing in any known petroglyph tradition in the Mid-Atlantic or Ohio Valley region. She photographed everything and filed a preliminary report recommending further study. The study was never funded. When I checked the Cultural Resources database 2 years later, the site had been recategorized from significant to undetermined without explanation. No one I spoke with could tell me who had changed it or why. I returned 3 more times between 2012 and 2018. The stones hadn't moved. The vegetation hadn't changed. And each time I noticed the same additional feature: silence inside the perimeter. Not the silence of a still day. The silence of a place where sound is being consumed. I clapped my hands inside the boundary. The sound died within feet. Absorbed, muffled, swallowed. I stepped outside the boundary, clapped again. Normal echo. The sound traveled. Inside the circle, sound stopped traveling. It arrived and was taken. On my last visit in 2018, I collected soil samples from inside and outside the perimeter with a probe. I sent them to a lab under the guise of a general survey. The results were identical: same pH, same mineral content, same organic composition, same microbial activity. There was no chemical explanation for the growth pattern. There was no chemical explanation for the silence. There was no explanation at all.
I stood in the center of those 40 acres and turned a slow circle. The stunted forest around me was dense at knee level, a carpet of green, extending to the ring of stones in every direction. Above the 3-foot line, nothing. Open sky. From the ground, outside the perimeter, you'd never know this place existed. The surrounding canopy conceals it completely, but from directly above, it would appear as a perfect clearing, a circle, a mark. Marking what? For whom? The stones say this is a boundary. The vegetation says something enforces it. The silence says, this place operates under different rules. Rules that were established before English was spoken on this continent. Rules that are still being followed by the trees, by the soil, by the sound waves, by whatever force maintains a 40-acre circle of precisely stunted growth in the middle of a national forest. Unchanged, unaged, and apparently permanent. I've shared the coordinates with 2 colleagues. Neither has visited. They've seen my photographs, my GPS tracks, my soil data. They believe me. They simply don't want to go there. And I understand that because I've been there 4 times, and each time I left with the same feeling that I was being tolerated. That the boundary was not keeping me out. It was showing me where the rules change. And something about the way those stones were placed, the patience of it, the permanence, tells me that whatever drew that line understood something about those 40 acres that we do not. Something that requires silence. Something that requires the forest to kneel. Until I understand what that something is, I'm content to know where the line is and to stay on the right side of it. This is the one I've never told anyone. Not colleagues, not friends, not the therapist I saw for 2 years after it happened. I'm telling it now because I'm 67 years old and I've carried it for 9 years, and the weight of it has changed shape but not mass. And I think if I don't set it down somewhere, it will be the last thing I think about when I die. And I'd prefer it not to be. In 2017, I was driving a forest road in the Nantahala, a road I'd driven dozens of times during my years stationed in western North Carolina. It was October. The mountains were on fire with color sugar maples in full scarlet, hickories gone gold, the sourwood already bare and skeletal against the ridge. The light was the way it gets in October in the southern Appalachians, low-angled, warm, turning everything it touches into something that looks like a memory of itself. I missed a turn. That's what I told myself. But the road I ended up on was paved, well-maintained. Not a forest road, not a logging track, a real road, with a center line and reflectors and the gentle engineered curves of a road built by someone who knew what they were doing. And it was not on my map. It was not on any map I've ever seen. The road descended into a valley I did not recognize. I knew the Nantahala. I'd driven every road in that forest, maintained or otherwise. I knew where every valley was, where every ridge ran, where every creek drained. I did not know this valley. The mountains on either side were real. I could see familiar ridge lines above them. But the valley between was new. As if a space had been opened between 2 pages of a book I'd read 100 times. The village was at the bottom, real buildings, a main street of sorts. A general store with goods visible through the window. A community hall with an open door. Houses with porches, with rocking chairs, with smoke rising from chimneys despite the mild weather. Children were playing in a yard. I could hear them before I saw them. The universal sound of young voices at a distance, high and unworried. An older man sat on a porch, whittling. The curls of pale wood fell around his boots. He looked up when my truck came into view and nodded. Not surprised, not concerned. The nod of someone who has been expecting you, or at least expecting someone like you for a while. And somewhere, from a direction I couldn't pin down, someone was playing a fiddle. Not performing, just playing. The notes drifted through the valley the way smoke drifts, unhurried, purposeless, beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they're not trying to be witnessed. It was a tune I almost recognized, almost. Like a song I'd heard as a child and forgotten, or a song that existed in the space between two songs I knew. I parked my truck and got out. No one reacted with alarm. The children glanced at me and returned to their game. The whittling man kept whittling. A woman walked toward me from the nearest house, middle-aged, dark-haired, wearing clothes that could have been sewn in 1920 or purchased from a catalog last week. "Are you hungry?" she asked. I said I was. She led me to her house. The interior was clean, simple, warm. A wood stove, a table with 4 chairs, shelves with jars of preserved food, green beans, tomatoes, apple butter. She set a plate in front of me. Cornbread, soup beans, cooked greens with a vinegar tang. A meal that could have been served in any decade of the last 2 centuries. It was without exaggeration the best food I have ever eaten. Not because it was extraordinary, because it was exactly what food is supposed to be: nourishing, honest, made by someone who knows how to make it and sees no reason to make it differently. I asked where I was. She told me the name of the village. I won't repeat it. She asked me not to, and I agreed, and that agreement is the one piece of that day I am certain was real and binding and not subject to the doubt that has consumed everything else. I asked how long the community had been there. She said, "Since before the mountains." I assumed she meant before the area was settled by Europeans, before the Cherokee, before whoever came before them. Now, years later, I'm not sure that's what she meant at all. The Appalachian Mountains are 480 million years old. She might have meant exactly what she said. I took photographs, dozens of them. The light was extraordinary that October afternoon. Light filtering through the valley like golden water, turning the clapboard buildings into something between architecture and painting. I photographed the main street, the store, the children, the mountains above. I used my phone and a field documentation camera. I stayed 3 hours. The people were warm but calibrated. They answered questions without volunteering information. Several of them seemed to know things about me. Not biographical facts, but qualities, characteristics. One man, younger than the others, looked at me for a long time and said, "You've been looking for us for a long time?" I hadn't been looking for anything. I'd been driving a road I knew. But maybe he was right. Maybe every story I'd collected, every hollow I'd explored, every silence I'd stood inside of, had been a form of looking. Maybe the village at the end of a road that doesn't exist was the destination for a journey I'd been on since I first set foot in these mountains 22 years earlier. When I stood to leave, the woman who'd fed me walked me to my truck. The light was failing that quick autumn transition from gold to gray. The fiddle had stopped. The children were gone from the yard. The village was quieting in the way villages do at dusk, gathering itself inward. She said, "You can come back, but you probably won't find us." She said it without sadness, without drama, like a weather report. statement of atmospheric conditions. The sky is blue. Water flows downhill. You probably won't find us. I drove out of the valley and back onto the forest road. The turn I'd missed was right where it always was. I drove home. That night, I uploaded my photographs. Every image from the village, every single one from both devices, was black. Not dark, not underexposed, not corrupted. The files were intact, properly sized, properly time-stamped, properly formatted. They contained data, and the data was nothing. Perfect, featureless, uniform black. As if the cameras had faithfully recorded what was in front of them. And what was in front of them was an absence shaped like a village. The photographs I'd taken earlier that day, the forest road, a waterfall I'd stopped at, a cluster of roadside asters were fine. The photographs I took the next day were fine. Only the village was gone. Only the 3 hours I'd spent there had been recorded as void. I went back the following week. I drove the same road. I slowed at the same curve. There was no turn. There was no side road. There was unbroken forest on both sides. Trees old enough that no road had been there in a century. The pavement I'd driven on, the center line I'd followed, the gentle engineered curves, none of it was there. The mountainside was solid. The valley did not exist. I sat in my truck for a long time. You can come back, but you probably won't find us. She was right. I've gone back 6 times. I've never found the road. I've never found the valley. The ridge lines I drove between are there, real and fixed, but there is no space between them. The book is closed. The page is gone. I retired from the Forest Service on schedule with a clean record and a full pension. Nobody knows that this story is the reason. Nobody knows that I stopped going into the mountains, truly into them, the way I used to alone for days at a time, because I could no longer trust that the landscape would be the same one I'd left. The therapist I saw for 2 years was helpful. She taught me techniques for managing the anxiety. She did not attempt to explain what I'd experienced, and I respected her for that. She said, whatever happened, it happened to you, and your experience of it is valid. That was enough. That was as much as anyone could offer. But sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and the windows are dark, I open the files. I look at those black photographs, and I think I see something in them. Not an image, not a shape, a depth. The blackness isn't flat, it recedes. It has distance in it, the way a deep well has distance when you look down into it and can't see the bottom. The black goes somewhere, and if I looked long enough, I think I might fall in. I don't look long enough. I close the file. I close the laptop. I turn on every light in the house. And I sit in the bright electric ordinary world. And I tell myself that what happened in 2017 was an anomaly, a glitch, a thing that happened once and will not happen again. But I remember the taste of that cornbread. I remember the sound of that fiddle. I remember the woman's face as she walked me to my truck. Not sad, not mysterious, just present. Present in a way that implied she had always been present. That she'd been standing on that porch before the porch was built. Before the valley was carved, since before the mountains. 13 stories. 13 places where the world is not what we agreed it should be. I've told you what I know. I've told you what I saw, what I heard, what I measured, what I couldn't find again. I've given you field log entries and GPS coordinates and census records and soil samples and the testimony of people who had nothing to gain from lying and everything to lose from being believed. And now I want to leave you with something that isn't a story. It's an observation. The Appalachian Mountains are old enough that the concept of age barely applies to them. They were here before the Atlantic Ocean existed. They were here before most of the life forms that currently walk the earth had evolved. They have watched everything that has ever happened on this continent. And they will watch everything that will happen after we are gone. And in the hollows in the deep, narrow, fog-filled valleys, where the sound doesn't carry right and the light doesn't last long, and the maps have always been approximate, there are communities that exist on a different schedule, communities where the population obeys a rule, not a count, where the dead maintain their routines, where the geography shifts when it's not being watched, where the forest kneels in a perfect circle and the sound goes somewhere else, where the cameras record nothing and the nothing has depth. I don't know what these places are. I don't know if they're remnants of something older or evidence of something still happening. I don't know if the people in them are people the way we understand the word, or if they're something else, something that looks like people, because that's the shape the mountains give to whatever lives inside them. I know that the hollow keeps count. I know that the singing hasn't stopped. I know that the curtains still move, one at a time in a village that isn't there. And I know that every time I tell these stories, something in me gets quieter, as if the telling is a subtraction, as if the memories are being heard by something other than the person I'm speaking to, as if the mountains are listening through the walls. I'm gonna stop now. I'm gonna turn off the lights and sit in the dark and be quiet. Because out here in the mountains, that's what you learn to do. You learn that the dark is not empty. You learn that silence is a language. And you learn that if you're still enough and patient enough and honest about what you've seen, the dark listens back